Hi, I'm Jared Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. When I left New York for North Carolina a few years ago, a strange thing happened to me. In the small plot of land behind the house where I was living was this little garden. And as I was settling into my new surroundings, I started tending to this garden. I'm not totally sure why. I started planting vegetables in it, and then I started eating those vegetables. And then when I moved to a house a year later that had more land, I brought the garden with me, and I've expanded it every year since. Every summer, I'm itching to plant new vegetables, to try new flower varieties, to experiment with placements and pairings and design. If you've talked to me in real life over the last 5 years, there's a really good chance that I've talked to you about my garden. It's become this strange, all-consuming hobby. And this hobby has made me realize two things. The first thing I realized is that I've started to believe that the best parts of garden design might actually be a model for the future of design practice, that the concerns of the garden, care, maintenance, ecologies, life, the more than human, are increasingly the concerns of all design fields. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly for this context, despite doing this show for almost a decade, I've never really had an episode dedicated to gardens. I've never had a landscape architect on the show, and it feels time to remedy that. And for me, there was no one better to think through these ideas with than David Godshall and Kasey Toomey. David and Kasey are partners at Terremoto, a landscape architecture design studio with offices in Los Angeles and the Bay Area in California. Terremoto was founded by David and Alan Perroy, and they create gardens that blend material exploration and conceptual ideas that seek to, as they say, quote, do right by the land. Their gardens are formally compelling and conceptually ambitious, and their work is rooted both in challenging historical and contemporary landscape construction methods, but also honoring the laborer, the ecosystem, the indigenous communities on whose land they now live and work and garden. As they say on their website, we revere the history of landscape architecture, but also kind of want to destroy it, which honestly I can kind of relate to in my own field. But what I think you'll find in this conversation, if it's not already evident, is that David and Kasey are also just really deep thinkers about what it means to design and tend to a garden. And so this is a very philosophical conversation. It's a conversation about what it means to garden, how we do right by the land, and how gardens are places that we need now more than ever. This ethos isn't just manifested in their designs, in their actual gardens, but also in how they live and how they work. So we talk about Terremoto's unique studio structure and how they got into labor activism and the role of that activism in their work. This was a conversation that was so inspiring and encouraging to me, and one that I think you will get a lot out of, even if you're not a gardener or a landscape designer or a landscape architect. I think the lessons from David and Kasey and the team at Terremoto are truly lessons for all of us. If you get something out of these conversations and what we do here at Scratching the Surface, you can support our work by joining our Substack. We have a monthly newsletter that is free for everyone, as well as a paid tier that gets you a bonus interview every month and really helps keep this show free for everyone. I hope this show is like listening to a great conversation in a coffee shop. And so for the price of a cup of coffee a month, you can help us do this work and put more of it out into the world. David Godshall and Kasey Toomey, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us. We're excited to talk to you and meander.
Likewise, Jared. Thanks.
You're the first landscape architects on the show. You're the first garden designers on the show. So this first question is either going to be the dumbest question of all or is the deepest question of all. What does it mean to design a garden?
What does it mean to design a garden? You're starting with a big one.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
what we do here.
we'll go existential and then work our way into the details. I'll start, Kasey, chime in. But I'm not quite sure what it means necessarily. But I guess what it is or what it involves is changing the condition of existing land from its present form or the form that we encounter it into another form.
Mm,
And I hope that the way Terremoto goes about approaching that responsibility actually will ultimately improve the ecological functioning of the land and or make it more in reciprocity with the place that the land actually exists. And it's a heavy question because I also think that there's a spiritual dimension to landscape architecture and garden design, and the fact that our profession has an uneasy and or uncomfortable relationship. I guess interfacing with the spiritual dimension of what we do is sometimes to its disservice. And I feel like if the word spirituality makes people uncomfortable, you can replace it with philosophy. But there's also that to it as well. Kasey, anything to add?
Yeah. I mean, to design a garden or to think about making a garden or the act of making a garden is often largely related to relationship to land and a conversation with the land. And the land means a lot of things. It means the critters. It means
yeah.
the larger ecological context that this thing is sitting within. And that thing that we're sitting within is also us as humans. So a garden is really kind of rooted in that conversation and that relationship to tend and our urge and our desires to tend and be one with um, those things, those critters, the kind of natural kind of environment that is surrounding us. That's kind of where we start, or that's what we think about is essentially us being part of that community, whether that's like an ecological community or it's a kind of plant community or it's a social community, it's a cultural community. It's this act of like kind of coming together with something other than us and kind of treating it equally as us. I think oftentimes when we are thinking about making gardens or we're kind of conceptualizing the act of making a garden, we are um, meaning Terremoto is often thinking about something that's not about dominion, that's about community or communal,
Hmm.
uh, as opposed to kind of this top-down approach or this plan view approach of making something, which uh, kind of implies authority. And essentially, when we're making gardens and when we're thinking about making gardens, we're kind of working around authority. We kind of like don't want to directly address authority because directly addressing authority implies that we know something.
Yeah.
And the act of actually making a garden is actually being truly humble and humbled by the thing that's going to die, humbled
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
Yeah,
placing a plant in the wrong place. Because gardens change, we change, everything changes. So it's just this constantly evolving conversation around land and community.
I love this idea of gardening or of designing a garden being a constantly evolving conversation. And I'm going to ask you one more just like big philosophical question, and then I promise it'll be much more practical after that. And tell me if I'm completely over complicating this here. But I love this idea of this ever evolving conversation because something I was thinking about as I was thinking about talking to you both is one of the one of the favorite things that I like about the word design is that design is both a noun and a verb. It is the thing that you make, but it is also the act of making the thing. And that sort of blurs the line between like process and product or like process and end result. And I was kind of struck as I was just thinking about talking to you that garden is the same thing. Garden is both a verb and it is a place, it is a thing. And you garden the garden kind of. And I guess maybe that is an overly philosophical way of asking is a garden ever a now? You know, a garden is never actually finished. A garden is always being gardened. Can you talk to me about how you think about that idea of process, of time, of lifespan, and what that means when you are at that origin point where you start to change the land, David, as you said, knowing that
Yeah.
this thing will actually never be quote unquote finished? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think what you're describing is one of the qualities that make gardens and landscapes inescapably different than architecture or
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
products or things that are more like fixed in time is that
mm-hmm,
gardens are through time.
mm,
And so that quality is kind of what makes them so special. One could construct an argument that also buildings exist through time and these things, but I would say that uh, it's the iterative and ongoing quality, or it's the ongoing and an iterative nature of a garden is what separates it from other products of cultural production. And so that's kind of what makes them so cool and special.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, is that they exist through time. And I was I was just thinking about this the other day, in that recent historical notions or expressions of landscape architecture and garden design mostly create a fixed thing. Like, if I'm going to be mean to like Versailles or neoclassical gardens or things like that, those are like fixed objects that are meant to be maintained mostly the same
mm-hmm, yeah,
in perpetuity, and we're not interested in that as
mm,
an office. So like leaning into the time aspect of gardens is kind of our favorite thing to do. And uh, I'm looking at our office garden here, and one of the greatest compliments that someone gave us is when they came here. They were like, "Every time I come here, it's completely different."
mm,
And I think that's what makes gardens so unique. And I'm going to be biased, but are a more interesting cultural product than things that are fixed and unchanging.
To kind of talk about maybe specifically some of the design aspect of that, or even like design communication around something that is constantly moving or changing, and backing our way into like talking about how we practice or how we communicate with clients or the
yeah,
public,
yeah,
in the sense that a plan is a very easy thing to comprehend and project and present to someone, and for someone to kind of understand what's in front of them. But the act of making a garden, as we just kind of spoke about, is an iterative
right,
thing. It's a layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. So what we actually find in terms of how we need to communicate and also get better at communicating is the fact that like we avoid trying to do final renderings or a
mm,
final finished looking representation of the garden that one is technically unrealistic. It's definitely a snapshot of what it could look like, but there's layers
yeah,
that will happen and continue to happen. And that's technically the hard part of being kind of a landscape architect, or a garden designer that's thinking about those things and operating only with that lens, is how do I communicate that process? How do I communicate this relationship that is an ongoing thing?
yeah,
You start to get into like steps, or this is what we're going to do now. The way that we kind of, as David was speaking about the office garden that he's sitting within, is we essentially had the idea of to plan to not to plan, which is
mm,
there is no plan. Let's
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
start now. Let's start that conversation right now, and then let's see where that conversation goes. And that conversation is the garden.
I love that. I think like comparing that to Versailles, for example, is actually uh, really makes that concrete in a weird way, because that doesn't feel alive. That doesn't feel like it's changing in a way that other gardens might. Let me ask you one more kind of basic question, then we can kind of actually get into the studio itself. Even just in the whatever 5 or 10 minutes that we've been talking, we've gone back and forth between garden and landscape. Is there a difference between garden design and landscape architecture, landscape design? Do you see those as different? is there a difference between a garden and a landscape? Talk to me about those two words for a second.
I will say that I spend kind of zero time thinking about the difference between a garden and a landscape. To me, they're one and the same to some degree. And the opportunities that are in front of me are, I don't necessarily think about them as a landscape or a garden. I think about it as we're just kind of speaking as an opportunity to kind of
Mm-hmm.
conversate with the land, and the thinking about the scale becomes less important to some degree because the first act is to do right by the land and then to kind of have that conversation with said client or community. So the way that I kind of think about that is generally kind of absent. Like there is no
Yeah.
difference in my mind.
I would say, like, to answer it with a more professional point of view. No, not that what you were saying was unprofessional. I mean it in the, like, landscape architecture as a profession tends to sometimes problematically try to differentiate itself from garden design or put itself like on a higher
Mm,
register,
hmm.
and we our office kind of rejects that,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that's in part maybe makes us unique in that we're interested in designing things of all scales and of all types, and to Kasey's point, making the our number one client at all times the land,
Yeah.
above all else.
On your website, you say we revere the history of landscape architecture, but also kind of want to destroy it too. What does that mean?
Uh, I mean, not to go back to Versailles as a thing, but you could say, like, to my earlier points of recent historical models of garden design or landscape architecture, mostly imposing control or form or
Hmm.
order on land, uh, is not of great interest to us, and we'd rather actually work with in relationships. We'd either actually rather like create relationships that are positive, in that classical gardens were about asserting dominion and authority onto
Yeah.
land as a way of
Yeah.
expressing the power of the king or whatever. And uh, we don't want to do that anymore,
Right.
or that doesn't seem like the thing that we should be doing given everything that's going on in the world presently.
Yeah. Is there in a lot of other design fields, let me put it this way. In a lot of other design fields, there's this movement for like human-centered design or user-centered design of kind of putting the person who will inhabit this space first. What are their needs? What are the thing they want to do? What are the tasks that they're going to complete in this space? And it seems like gardens, you can't do that. It seems like the user, which feels like a wrong word to even say for a garden, the human is one of many pieces. And Kasey, you said this earlier about thinking about the ecological community. How do you how do you think about the inhabitants of a garden? That it is not just your client, but also the wildlife, the plants, the soil, all of this. How do all of those come together to do this phrase that you've used a couple of times, to do right by the land? How do you? I don't. I'm sorry, I don't have the language for this. How do you
Yeah,
balance those? How do you reconcile those? How do you start to put those in conversation?
The way that we would approach said project or said garden or said landscape is we kind of do some site analysis for our side, which is kind of analyzing a lot of the environmental conditions, and we're talking about very traditional kind of bones of landscape architecture of sun, shade,
Mhm,
existing
mhm, mhm.
trees, slope, topography, water, that type of stuff. And that stuff is the things that we kind of need to absorb from the site. And there's also things that are harder to absorb that require kind of a longer term engagement with the land, seasonality, et cetera, et cetera. But our point of view is to kind of capture that as much as humanly possible and fold that into the design, but also position the client and the garden and the landscape as part
Mm,
of this thing that's larger than this site, the thing that's outside of
yeah.
the fence, outside of the property line, outside of the plaza is technically all the things that we're connecting to and want to be a part of. So we often kind of in the earlier stages of the project kind of present what we kind of call as like an earth calendar, which is kind of noting this is the rainy season, this is the fire season, this is when particular plants of your site or property are in bloom or in connection to a pollinator,
Mm,
or its nesting period for this particular bird that we heard on your site. And to present that to the client so that one kind of now sees and feels the openness and the kind of breadth of what the landscape and garden actually is, that it's not
Yeah.
just this thing in front of us. It's
mm.
it's this larger kind of move that we want to be a part of, and that your garden should be a part of.
And that though you might have property lines, uh, water and insects and birds don't care or see those property
Right,
lines, and that
right.
your land exists in the flow of systems that are much greater than the boundaries of your land necessarily.
Let's kind of go back in time and put some of these big ideas that we've been talking about into some context.
Sure.
David, you co-founded Terremoto about 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago now at this point, 12 years ago.
12-ish. Yep. Yep.
And I've heard you talk about when you started that you wanted to treat gardens as cultural and material investigations. What did that look like? What were these ideas that were driving your work? What were these cultural investigations that you wanted to explore through gardening?
It totally varies from project to project. And that's because every client is different, every piece of land is different. We work in different regions, both the Bay Area and in Southern California. And so, um, yeah, we found that gardens were very friendly or generous places to explore these ideas. And I should be more specific. So, for example, actually on your friend Adam's house, what a thing that we quietly explored on that project was, might we, through thoughtful dimensioning of all the things we're doing with both building steps and a deck, might we be able to make a project that reduces material waste to be as
Mm,
minuscule or invisible as possible? And so what Danny and I did on that project is we simply studied standard lumber dimensions, and then everything we built was a either to one of those standard material dimensions or like half of it. So we got 8 foot pressure treated lumber for the stairs down the hill, and we just chopped those in half, and then there was
mhm.
no material waste. And the deck that we built was basically two standard material dimensions, and so that was like a quiet little investigation or exploration on that project. But that's much more of a technical investigation. In other projects, it's things that are more, desert garden also be can a desert garden also abide by like Japanese gardening principles? Can we fuse those worlds?
Mm,
So depending on the project, it varies wildly. And I should also say that though that's still a thing that we very much do as an office, I would say that that was how Alan and I kind of started the office, as a way of kind of taking our work into like strange and interesting places. But and though we still do that, I would say there's the office has changed and meandered like since that origin point. So we're also exploring like other things as well.
I want to talk about that change in a second, but I have one more question about kind of those early years where, and I understand the site, the garden, the client, that would change these investigations. Would those derive from the process? You visit a site and you think, I want to explore this. It sounds like with like
Sure.
a material investing, it's like, hey, we want to see like how can we reduce waste, and then you're like, oh, here's a project where we can start to do that. How do you go from idea? I guess the question I'm asking is like, how do you connect idea to place or idea to garden? How does that kind of transition happen?
I would say that sometimes we have a sense of what we want to explore before the project starts, and sometimes we just have to start.
Mm,
Like these ideas don't necessarily always hit us up front. And so I would be remiss if I were to say to you, like, we have all these ideas
right. No, I totally understand.
yeah, so sometimes we just get into the process. Sometimes we'll finish the damn thing, and then we have to look back at it and be like, oh, that's what we were doing. And then
Ah,
sometimes it's reflection.
yeah.
Where these investigations happen isn't necessarily linear. It's more meandering than that. Sorry to keep landing on that word. But yeah.
maybe I'm reading into your face and the way you answered that last question. It sounds like this idea of like a conceptual or cultural investigation is less interesting to you, or you don't want to be defined. You sort of hinted that you've changed.
Oh,
Tell me
I
about that change.
uh, I'll ping it to you in 1 second, Kasey. But though those cultural or material investigations are still very much a part of what we do, I'd say that in the last 10-ish, 12-ish years, what's happened is that we've gone from an office of 2 people to an office of 26-ish people.
Mm.
The incredible designers that work on our team bring their own ideas into the fold. And the world's changed a lot in the last 12 years. And so, though these cultural investigations or examinations are still very much important, I would say that what's of even greater importance to us as an office now is being very thoughtful about all the systems that
Mm-hmm.
we engage with when we make gardens. Those systems being plants or ecology, materials, labor, and land. And so, what's maybe of greater interest to us now after 12 years of practice is building gardens that are omnipositive or all good in the way they interact with materials, plants, labor, and land. So it's all at once. Everything
Yeah.
hits at once.
Yeah, I think what David is kind of speaking to in terms of the evolution and the kind of growth of the office from 2 to 25-ish, and the kind of unicorn nature of our office, in the sense that we really truly believe in the individuality of our designers, and that there is, in essence, pretty much a lack of hierarchy throughout our office in terms of what a traditional office might be kind of formulated around. So when David was speaking about like the idea of us wanting to kind of, we respect landscape architecture, but we also want to destroy it. It's also tied into like how we are internally structured and how we kind of operate, and also what makes us us in terms of each project, each site is unique and specific because it's also being led by a very specific person with their point of view,
Mm-hmm.
which we allow to blossom and kind of take take the lead and take the charge, which is different in a lot of
Yeah.
top-down offices.
Yeah.
And essentially, I'm a partner, David's a partner. We have two other amazing partners, and that we're around for, those intimate conversations, but we are also receiving direction and design point of view from the designers, from the staff, which are leading the project.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about this and thinking about the evolution of your practice, and I want to kind of put a theory to you and let you riff on it or tell me that I'm completely wrong. But in the early years, as with any type of practice, you have these ideas and you kind of sneak them into projects where you can, and a lot of those they're things from your own personal interests or material investigations like you were talking about. But it seems to me that as you've grown, as you've gotten a name, I actually think there is still a experimental quality to what you're doing. I still think all of your gardens are investigations, but they are, I'm going to say something that's going to sound like a hierarchy, and I don't mean it like that, but a higher level of investigation in how
Yeah.
you're thinking about labor, how you're thinking about how the office is structured, how you're thinking about the hierarchy of the office, how you're thinking about the ecosystems that we were talking about earlier. That all of those are actually the core of the investigations now in some way, or the core of the gardens. Does that sound right to you?
I would agree with that. And I almost think it's the gift of time has allowed us to
Yeah.
almost broaden,
Yeah.
and the gift of time and experience has allowed us to like broaden the lens through which we make these investigations. Almost like we didn't start the office to be labor
Right.
activists, but what ended up happening is through documenting process, which we believe is beautiful, and through being transparent about the human beings that build our projects, thinking on that longer, having conversations as an office about what that means, and then slowly coming to the conclusion that the fact that most mainstream design and publications make invisible the contribution of the labor labor seems really crappy to us.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
with time and having conversations on that, we're like, oh, well, maybe we do need to actually improve our stance about labor and be more proactive about how we feel about it and the contribution and wisdom of the laborer, et cetera, et cetera. So, and so now we are labor activists. So that wasn't,
Right.
it's almost,
Right.
again, the path led us there. And so keeping our hearts and minds open to seeing our blind spots and giving ourselves the space to realize a way we might have recently historically done a thing might not be great, having that conversation and then figuring out what the path forward is something that we do as a team.
Yeah. And that seems like that happens at every stage of the process. So just for listeners who maybe aren't familiar with the studio structure and the labor aspect of your work. So, you sort of hinted already, you have a very light hierarchy in the office. You have 4 partners, but everybody is involved. Every designer kind of can lead projects on their own.
Correct.
Tell me if all of this is still up to date and accurate.
Yep.
You pay hourly instead of salary. And so that way, if people are working
Correct.
overtime, they get paid for that. And you try not to work overtime. So everyone's working around 40 hours a week,
Yep.
each team, with full benefits, all of that. I think there's some profit sharing also, or there's
Our
going to be
our
profit sharing.
We, at quarterly intervals, 40% of all profit is distributed amongst
Okay.
employees in a through like a mathematical equation that works with the number of hours they work, and so it's kind of run as a socialist enterprise in a
Yeah,
way.
I love that. I
Yeah,
love that. And then you give every team member a decent amount of autonomy to run their projects. It's not top down, Kasey, like you were saying. Is there
correct.
is there anything else studio model that should be mentioned that is unique in the field of landscape architecture?
Um, we go on a retreat. This is kind of a humble brag.
I,
We do a
I had
week
a
long
note of
retreat
that,
every
but I was
year.
like, that sounds less interesting than profit
Uh,
sharing, hourly.
yeah, it is less interesting. The profit sharing is actually quietly super important because then what that does is it motivates everyone to
Yeah,
run their projects
yeah,
efficiently and profitably because we share profit.
yeah.
So yeah,
But the retreat does speak to kind of the culture that
Mm-hmm.
we kind of put forth and the fact that we do work really closely together. We don't have that many people, not that many people have ever left the office. So there's this ongoing kind of community and kind of almost family connection between people. And, our kids have grown up together.
Mm-hmm.
That type of kind of aspect of our work in some sense actually goes back into the actual work to some degree because of that kind of familiarity, comfortableness, connection to others kind of bleeds into the work in very natural ways.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
I should also add to that is that we want to acknowledge that this model that we have almost requires that we stay a certain size.
Mm.
I think a lot of like these boundaryless things that we're talking about, or this lack of hierarchy, works because we are a certain scale,
Yeah, yeah,
divided between 2 offices, and so it's something we're very cognizant and thoughtful on when it comes to growth and like our long-term plan and trajectory as an office, because at a certain point, at a certain number, hierarchy would almost be required.
right.
Just humans we are biological animals that have patterns and things we do, and so again, a thing that we think about and kind of discuss as we think about like the long-term goals
Yeah.
and aims of the office.
And then on the labor side, and I'm sorry if I'm like connecting these. I
No,
realize these
please.
are 2 separate things, but I think I'm building to a bigger bigger question. On the labor side, you already mentioned there's just a sort of really problematic trend in landscape architecture. I would argue in any kind of design field of not acknowledging or giving credit to the people that actually do the work, that are building the garden, building the structure, whatever. But that's not all you're doing. You're not just giving them credit or making them known. From what I understand, you have close relationships with the actual gardeners and the people building these gardens. You work with them to revise planting plans. They are as involved in the process as your full-time employees in the studio. tell me how you arrived at that. Tell me about the evolution of you. And David, the reason I'm asking you this is because you said we sort of meandered our way into becoming labor activists. Tell me
Yeah.
a little bit about that meander. Give me that journey a little bit.
When so I founded the office with a guy named Alan Peroy, who passed away in January, actually. Alan was awesome. And in the early days, he and I simply kind of decided that with something we had witnessed at other offices that we had worked at was that there was oftentimes an antagonistic relationship between the designer and the builder. And that felt very counterproductive to us. And so just when we started the business, he and I were like, well, let's just be friends with the builders. That seems more
Mm-hmm.
fun.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a thing that we did, is just kind of treated builders with kindness and respect. And it's just made things much smoother and more pleasurable for us as we work. Um, and then I simply always had a camera glued to me when I would go to job sites, because we found process beautiful. And also, when we started the office, we didn't have any built work to speak of. And so rather than showing finished gardens, we just started putting
Yeah.
pictures of all the stuff we were up to on the website. Um, and then through time, that slowly became like more formalized as we, again, had the gift of time and experience to think on it, and uh, become slowly irritated by the fact that most design monographs just show perfect pictures of empty buildings, but gardens are very much like living, changing things.
Does all these ideas around the studio structure, around the hierarchy, or the labor activism, does that manifest itself in the garden in any way? Does that change actually the work itself? Does that change to go back to my first question, the design of the garden at all?
I fundamentally think so. And how we operate in terms of design, sometimes design isn't needed or necessary in some instances and moments. It's actually just action and it's
Mm.
tending that need
Uh,
to happen, and that design can get in the way of
yeah.
that thing. Because most of the time, or some of the time, we are thinking about a plan or a design, and getting it to a point as quickly as possible, getting it to a pricing point or to price by a contractor. And then once we're at that point, okay, plans out the door a little bit, and we're on the site and managing and talking to the contractor and also engaging with them. And a lot of the times, you know, they essentially have a lot more information in terms of how something wants to get built, more than we do. And we rely on them to do it excellently and with the skilled labor that they have. And oftentimes, in ways to kind of give them power on site in a lot of ways is to actually invite them into conversations with the client about like, our one of our preferred contractors or our closest contractors, his name is Carmen. We would ask Carmen, what do you think? How should we do this? Which is to say, you have an immense amount of knowledge, and we rely on you to build this thing beautifully. So please tell us how you would like to build it, as opposed to us saying, please build it this way. There's a lot of give and take, but we're also respectful of contractors, expertise, knowledge, and the
Mm.
opportunity
Yeah.
actually for them to teach us something at the same time, because they may know something more than we do. And I think being
Yeah,
humble enough to acknowledge that and kind of accept that is a lot of what our point of view may be on labor, is actually just being extremely humble and patient, and being able to kind of allow others to kind of sing or be part of the chorus.
I'm thinking about everything that you're saying, Kasey, here about your process and how that changes the design process. And I'm thinking about what you said earlier about thinking about gardens as in this infinite conversation with the land, with the living creatures there, with the person.
maintenance.
Yeah, the maintenance of it, the time at the overtime. And it strikes me that the studio setup is actually a physical embodiment of those ideals of the garden too. of we are a part of a community. We are all in dialogue with each other. We are all here to help each other. That in some ways, the design of the garden or the aesthetics of the garden are an embodiment of the ideals that you are trying to live in the studio. Maybe?
No, that's very sweet and a kind compliment. And I've never like with total clarity uh, thought about that. So that's very interesting that you say that, Jarrett.
I mean, I'm thinking about this like this sort of like that you're not trying to dominate the land or colonize the land, and that's
Yeah,
actually kind of how you're running the studio too. That's actually kind of how you all work together.
I sometimes think that Terremoto is a experiment in defining new relationships of power,
Mm-hmm,
but both as an
mm-hmm.
office and in the way we practice. In that uh, classical gardens require an imposition of form as a way of exerting power or making power manifest in the landscape. And because that is not our interest, uh, we're much more interested in exploring that if we can make gardens that have omnipositive relationships to all the systems that they engage with, that then beauty emerges
Yeah.
from those positive relationships. So rather than imposing beauty or requiring beauty of a garden, instead, through thoughtfulness and kindness, beauty emerges out of the garden.
You in an interview a couple years ago with Frontier Magazine, you said you want to see beauty as an emergent property, and you said we want to encourage the beauty found in the aliveness or the kindness or the gentleness of what we do as landscape makers, and that I feel like is where this connection starts to happen because this aliveness, kindness, gentleness is also just the structure of how you work. That's not actually just the manifestation in the garden. So tell me what you mean by this idea of beauty as an emergent property.
That means that if the garden is designed uh, with, okay, I'll start. I'll just go through each piece. Materials. So as a start, we try to use materials that are hyper local to a site. We try to reuse a lot of materials that we encounter on site, and we do this because there's a carbon or ecological footprint to making things, and so we can minimize the negative environmental externalities that building a garden sometimes creates through using materials that are hyperlocal.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Plants.
Which is to also kind of note that beauty isn't necessarily a purchase shiny thing. It's a thing that one can kind of develop and come to, which is a
Uh-huh.
different aesthetic, which is a different point of view, which
Yeah,
is extremely where we want to go. And essentially the world is kind of asking for that to kind of be a thing. So that's also tied to like materials is to like
yep,
keep it extremely local and to not demolish
Yeah,
everything. Like
yeah.
we can actually build upon the thing that's before us. And wouldn't it be nice if we actually did that as opposed to destroying everything that we don't necessarily agree with?
yep.
Why don't we build on it
Right.
essentially?
Then in regards to plants, we usually plant mostly native plants. And we do that because then our gardens provide habitat and food and shelter for the creatures with whom we share the planet. And also, once a native garden is established, then it needs no ongoing supplemental irrigation
Mm-hmm.
or
Mm-hmm.
material throughputs. It can just exist in perpetuity. Uh, Labor, I can just
Yes.
mention that through kindness to laborers and the things that we kind of just said in the preceding 20 minutes, that our gardens, that no one is exploited in the creation of our gardens, because it seems like it would be a crappy thing to build a sustainable garden, but the labor is like exploited.
Right.
And
Right.
so maintaining thoughtfulness towards our relationship to labor. And lastly, land. Uh, uh, Whether it's through land acknowledgements or through studying how people at a different time in the land used to use that land is something that we do, as well as being, to Kasey's earlier point, being really kind to existing conditions. Uh, Showing up at a site and killing a tree is like the last thing we want to do. And so oftentimes what we try to do when we start a project is to come to understand the flows of the land and to be very thoughtful about what's working and why, because we believe that minimizing our intervention, but while also still maintaining maximum impact, is like kind of an interesting way to flow. So through being thoughtful of those four relationships in all the ways, that is kind of how we do it.
Yeah, it's almost like beauty becomes in this context less an aesthetic that it's an aesthetic that emerges
No,
out of an idea, I guess.
totally. And it's
Yeah.
interesting because I've thought about this before. What ends up happening is the aesthetics matter less, but
Right.
the aesthetics still matter. So how it gets back into where aesthetics land in the hierarchy of all these things is kind of like an interesting thing. And the sweetness is it takes the work into like interesting new territory and places.
And I imagine for every project, those dials are slightly different.
Mhm.
Sometimes beauty is at the very bottom. Sometimes that's beauty in
Yep.
the traditional sense, is slightly higher. And that's all, land, client, how all of these things fit together.
The aesthetic or the idea of beauty might be more in the forefront of, again, that kind of dominion, that top-down approach, where you're shooting for something or you have a goal of what it wants to look like. Kind of how we operate or how we kind of process how to interact with the land is that aesthetic component is something that we back our way into, and that kind of sometimes comes at the tail end because it is what it is. We reuse this material, we planted these native plants, we now have these pollinators coming in, and now this is the aesthetic. This is
Right.
specific to the site, this is specific to the client and to the variables that are that we're working within and around. So it's a new aesthetic, but it's like a responsive aesthetic. It's a
Yeah.
responsive and also maybe responsible aesthetic at the same time.
Yeah. It's less about like what color gravel do you want, and more like this is the gravel we're using because this is what's local and is actually the vernacular of this place. And so it's interesting and challenging because also it what's going on to like a point that you made earlier in the conversation, Jarrett, is that we're actually like decentering the human.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So the human is a part of the garden, and their role and presence in the garden should absolutely be accommodated, but it shouldn't necessarily be the number one priority of the garden.
You've previously described, I haven't heard you describe Terremoto in this way in a while, but in early talks, early lectures, interviews, you've described the Terremoto aesthetic or philosophy as post-internet. Is that something that still
Sure.
feels accurate to you? What does that mean?
Like I've heard of architecture offices or design offices referring to, or older in a previous era, people would say post-war in relation. And I think that term emerged because at that point in time, World War II was the greatest event that had like most recently happened. I would say that in our era of being, the creation of the internet is one of the most important things that has happened. And I'll spare you my diatribe or current thinking on where technology is taking us, and instead say that I think I use the term post-internet to describe our office as a way of kind of gently suggesting that we do not design with a particular style in mind. What the internet did, one of the good things the internet did was kind of everything culturally got mixed up in that everyone was very aware and seeing what we were all doing across the world at the same time. And so to me, post-internet implies that we are not of a singular identifiable style because we have this tool that allows us to look at the world or all of human civilization like in a condensed sort of a way.
And I think when you live in that world and everybody has access to everything and any style can be mixed with anything else, that's where these questions of labor, of ecology,
Sure.
like all of that becomes more important.
Sure. And that's where actually a return to localism becomes quite interesting. Given that it can be anything, what should it be? And maybe what it should be is really kind to the local place and flows in which it finds itself. So there's an interesting dynamic there.
Yeah.
I think I don't know if this should make it on, but I guess what I always actually interpreted that as,
Oh, I'm
uh,
excited.
which is to say that our office, um, when civilization ends and the internet kind of collapses upon itself, our office would continue to operate in the beautiful way that we operate because we aren't relying upon that as our structure, and that we are extremely locally thinking extremely locally and softly and gently, which is the complete opposite of what the internet culture
Mm.
would,
Oh,
would
that's
be.
interesting.
Yeah,
That's actually how I've always interpreted post-internet,
I like that.
is through
I'm
that
down with
lens.
that. Well, I would also say that like COVID kind of exposed the fragility of like our globally interconnected world, right?
Yeah.
But what was interesting is when it happened, our office was kind of unaffected because we don't rely on things that are coming from far away. So we actually got busier than ever in this kind of strange moment.
So that I also, Kasey, really like that interpretation of post-internet, and it sort of speaks to a theory that I have that hopefully I can turn into a question for you. I really just want to kind of run this by you and see what you think. But as I told you before we started recording, I've gotten very seriously into gardening over the last 5 years, and
Cool.
anyone who has talked to me in real life over the last 5 years has heard me, talk about tomatoes or flower varieties or something. It's just completely kind of random, uh, seemingly
And
random hobby. But what has been interesting to me as I have slowly dipped my feet into this world is I have this theory that if you want to understand the future of the design fields, that garden design is actually where you should be looking, or the ideal future of the design fields. Because I think whether that's graphic design, my profession, or architecture, or like product design or industrial design, digital design, even we can talk about the internet and everything bad there. When you
Mhm.
look at when you look at gardens, uh, you're thinking immediately about maintenance. You're thinking about repair. You're thinking about care. You're thinking about ecology. You're thinking about community. You're thinking about lifespans beyond the immediate need. There's something like, I'm hesitant to say this, there's something borderline anti-capitalist about gardens too,
Yeah.
in some sense. And that's all just inherent in the garden, in the shaping of the garden. I realize I'm asking you to say like, yes, we're doing the right work, but does that sound right to you? Is there something
Yeah.
to this theory?
Casey and I are collaborating with Ohio State University and the Columbus Museum of Art right now, and we had a wonderful time fighting with our friends Danny and Michelle recently because, in case he disagrees with me on this point, but indulge me 1 minute of a ramble in that um, I actually differentiate. I don't consider garden design or landscape architecture to be art. I actually believe that art is art, architecture is architecture, landscape architecture or garden design. That those are different things. Um, they are all modes of cultural production and cultural expression. But the reason, and I say this, of course, being terribly biased towards landscape architecture or garden design, I think what makes landscape architecture or garden design unique is that it requires care.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's like the reason why, as a reaction to the global predicament in which we find itself, garden design or landscape architecture is slightly more well positioned to evolve and change and respond to this strange time in which we like find ourselves as a culture and a civilization. Because care and or taking care of the land around you is potentially one way through or
Mm-hmm.
out of this predicament. Kasey, please add to that.
I think it's extremely important because the act of maintenance, the act of care is extremely integral. It's the scaffolding of the garden or a
Yeah,
landscape, and that once that's removed, or once you are no longer tending, once you are no longer watching and engaging with said garden or landscape, that's when things go awry,
yeah.
essentially, or things take over and it's no longer a garden, it's kind of something else. And it's that conversation, it's that feedback loop as well of plants die in the garden, or you can plant the wrong plant in the garden. The land has to tell you that, nope, that's not the right
Mm-hmm.
one.
Mm-hmm.
You thought that was the right one, but it is actually not the right one. And being able to accept that information and kind of move forward is something
Yeah.
that is maybe important to the world
And
currently.
failure is very acceptable in the sense of a garden, whereas like in a capitalist society, failure or death is unacceptable, and it is a
Mm-hmm.
thing to be solved. And in a garden, it's part of all the flows.
Yeah, and the thing that I like about that is actually that word requires.
Yeah,
Care is not optional here. Like you
yeah,
actually need it, or else it literally will die. And
yeah.
I think that is a lesson that, not to make this into an indictment of all the other design fields, but I think that's a lesson
No,
that all the other design fields um, can take more seriously. And I also think that's something that is so clearly rooted in the work that you all are doing across everything, across the gardens, across the studio structure, across the labor activism. I think care is actually like a really great word for everything that we talked about on this conversation. So I think that's a really nice place to wrap up. David, Kasey, thanks so much for doing this. This was so fun for me.
yeah. I feel like we just scratched the surface. Thank you for starting with an existential question. I like that. Right off the bat.
Yeah,
Bam.
that's what I'm here for.
Cool.
That was my conversation with Terremoto's David Godshall and Kasey Toomey. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Chu. The show is funded thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. If you like what we're doing, I hope you consider supporting us and get some bonus content each month. You can follow us across social media at Surface Podcast, and you can listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at our website, scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.